A woman stumbled into our police station at 3:23 a.m., her footsteps echoing in the quiet of the early morning, her face pale and glistening with sweat as she begged to be arrested. The fluorescent lights above buzzed faintly, casting harsh shadows across her trembling frame. "What crime have you committed?" I asked, my voice steady but laced with curiosity.
"None!" She choked out, her chest heaving as her lungs struggled to recover from what must have been a desperate sprint to the station. Her hands clutched at the edge of the counter, her knuckles white.
I frowned from behind the counter, my fingers tapping idly on the worn wood, readying myself for one of those long, unpredictable nights. But as her words hung in the air, I felt a prickle of unease. This would be a night unlike any other in my life. "Then why should I arrest you, ma'am?" The frail woman, still catching her breath, with hands braced against her knees, cranked her neck backwards so sharply that the joint popped a sickening crack that seemed to reverberate through the empty station. Her dark hair clung to her forehead, damp with sweat, and her eyes were wide, almost too large for her face. "Because," she said, taking a shuddering inhale that seemed to pull the air from the room, "we're all in danger." Her eyes began to dart frantically between the station's glass entrance and me, as if expecting something to burst through the doors at any moment. The way her gaze flickered made my skin crawl, as though she saw something I couldn't. I leaned my elbows a little more deeply into the counter, the wood creaking under my weight, and pushed forward to get a better look at the building's automatic doors. Beyond the glass panes, the night was an impenetrable void, nothing but the glint of wet tarmac under distant streetlights and the faint skeletal outlines of trees swaying in the wind. The silence outside was oppressive, broken only by the occasional rustle of leaves skittering across the pavement. "Is somebody following you?" I asked, my voice lower, now tinged with concern. She shook her head like a bobblehead, each movement jerky and unnatural, making her neck pop again, once, twice. I winced at her frailty. She slung her skull around with such violence that I half expected it to snap free, as if she were trying to hurl it across the room like a baseball pitched for a home run. Her thin frame seemed barely able to support her, and yet there was a strange intensity in her movements, like a puppet jerked by invisible strings.
"No, I'm just checking," she whispered, stepping closer to the counter, her voice barely audible over the hum of the station's lights. "That we're alone. Now I'm an officer of the law. I've faced men and women with twice and thrice the stature of this small, frightened woman, burly drunks, hardened criminals, and volatile suspects. I've stared down danger without flinching. But in that moment, I couldn't explain the terror that gripped me. It wasn't her appearance or her words alone. It was something deeper, something primal, as if the air itself had thickened with an unseen presence.
Her breath, or the words carried on, it chilled me to the bone. It was as if her voice had reached inside me, wrapping cold fingers around my spine. "There are 3 other officers at the station tonight." I croaked, my throat dry before clearing it with a cough. "We're not alone." "Will those doors count?" she asked, her voice trembling as she glanced at the glass entrance again. Her body shivered not from cold, but from something else, something that made her seem like she was fraying at the edges. "Count in what way?" I replied, my confusion growing. The station felt too large, too exposed with its high ceilings and wide windows. The shadows in the corners seemed to shift slightly, though I told myself it was just my imagination.
"I need the smallest indoor space possible," she said, her words tumbling out in a rush. "He told me that I won't be able to exit a room or a building or a prison without spoken approval. He said I'd need permission to leave." Her voice cracked on the last word, and she clutched her arms around herself as if trying to hold something inside.
"Who told you that?" I asked, my mind racing to make sense of her ramblings. "I don't understand, Ma'am. Explain what's happening."
Do I have to do something criminal? She asked, her body shaking harder, now her eyes pleading. You won't just arrest me?
That's generally how it works, I replied, trying to keep my tone calm, though my pulse was beginning to race. I'm just a little concerned about why you want to be locked away this morning. I assume it has something to do with keeping yourself safe by getting off the street, given that you say you're in danger. However, jail cells aren't hotel rooms, so...
I don't need to protect myself, she interjected, her voice dropping to a hiss, her wild eyes locking onto mine with an intensity that made my breath catch. I need to protect all of you.
The words landed like a physical blow, and for a moment the station seemed to grow darker, the air heavier. The hum of the lights grew louder, or perhaps it was just the blood pounding in my ears. "What's happening out here?" James Officer Laura asked, as she emerged from the office behind me, her boots clicking on the linoleum floor. Her presence was a small relief, but the tension in the air didn't dissipate.
I tried my hardest not to show my unease, but this unnerving woman was making it difficult. My hands felt clammy against the counter. This lady is asking to be arrested, but she says she hasn't committed a crime.
Officer Laura raised an eyebrow, her expression a mix of skepticism and concern. She put her hands on her hips, her uniform crisp despite the late hour, and looked at the woman. "What's your name, love?"
Clara, she said, her voice barely above a whisper. Please, will one of you lock me up? I need to be locked up. Something bad's about to happen.
"What's about to happen?" Clara asked Officer Laura, her tone gentle but firm, like she was talking to a frightened child. "I don't know," Clara blubbered, burying her face in her hands. Her shoulders shook with silent sobs and her words came out muffled. "It's inside me." Those words and the raw, trembling despair in her voice sent a wave of fear through me that defied description. It wasn't just fear, it was something alien, something that didn't belong in this world. It was as if her words had opened a crack in reality, letting something cold and wrong seep through. The station, usually a place of order and routine, felt suddenly like a stage for something far darker. Officer Laura, however, seemed unfazed, her pragmatism a stark contrast to my growing dread. She leaned toward my ear, her voice low. "I think we need to get this lady some psychiatric help. She might be in danger," I whispered back, my eyes still fixed on Clara as she wept. The way her hands clawed at her face made me uneasy, as if she were trying to tear something away from herself. "She might be Laura," agreed, her tone measured. "But that's for a healthcare professional to decide, don't you think? Not two police officers at 3 o'clock in the morning." I nodded, my throat tight, and spoke louder to Clara. "Clara, I'm going to leave you with Officer Laura for a second while I make a call in the office, okay?" Clara shot her head up from her hands as I stood from the swivel chair, her eyes wide and glistening with tears. "No, please, just arrest me. There isn't time for any of this." Her voice was desperate, almost a scream, and her hands reached out as if to grab me, though she stayed rooted to the spot.
"I need you to relax, Clara," Laura said, stepping forward with a calm authority. "We're going to help you, okay? We're going to figure out what's happening together."
I shut the office door behind me, the click of the latch sounding unnaturally loud in the quiet. My heart was pounding as I dialed the number for the mental health specialist. The idea was to avoid upsetting Clara further. Laura and I had no idea how she'd react to the arrival of a professional, so we kept it discreet. The office was a small, cluttered space, filled with the faint smell of stale coffee and old paperwork. Through the horizontal one-way window overlooking the main entrance, I watched Laura and Clara talk. Laura's posture was steady, her hands gesturing calmly, while Clara's movements were erratic, her head twitching as she glanced repeatedly at the glass doors. The phone rang, each tone stretching the silence, and when I finally connected with a specialist, I explained the situation in detail. Clara's fear, her cryptic warnings, her insistence on being locked up. The specialist agreed that Clara needed a proper health assessment and recommended bringing her to the hospital.
I know it's late, I said, my voice steady despite the unease gnawing at me, so I'm happy to escort her to the hospital.
And then came a voice that wasn't quite the specialist's. It was low, guttural and wrong, like a sound scraped from the bottom of something ancient and forgotten. "No, we'll escort you all." The words sent a jolt through me, my hand tightening around the phone. Before I could process the sudden shift in the specialist's vocal timbre, I noticed Clara staring directly at me through the one-way window. She shouldn't have been able to see me. The glass was designed to prevent that, but her eyes locked onto mine with an unnatural certainty. Her lips curled into a grin wide and wrong, stretching her face in a way that made my stomach lurch. That grin, predatory and knowing, filled me with a terror so visceral it felt like a physical weight pressing against my chest. Then the lights in the station cut out. The sudden darkness was suffocating, swallowing the room in an instant. A sharp pang of terror stabbed through me, lingering like a blade lodged between my ribs. My phone's screen cast a weak, ghostly glow across my face, the only light in the pitch-black office. My breath came in shallow gasps, and the invisible weight in my chest grew heavier, as if something was watching me from the shadows. With the phone trembling in my hand, I stumbled out of the office and into the darkened area behind the counter. The station felt different now, too quiet, too still, like a place abandoned by the living. I flicked on my phone's torch, its narrow beam cutting through the darkness, but Officer Laura was gone. When I swung the light beyond the counter, Clara was nowhere to be seen either. The empty space where they'd stood felt like a void, swallowing the last shred of normalcy. "Hello," a voice called from down the corridor, sharp and panicked as my fear tightened its grip. A torch beam bounced along a distant hallway beyond the counter, its light painting fleeting patterns on the walls. It offered a fleeting reprieve from the suffocating darkness, but the shadows seemed to writhe at the edges of the beam. Then Officer Thomas appeared in the entryway, his face pale and drawn under the glow of his flashlight.
"Oh, James, thank God someone's here," he sighed, directing the torch beam onto me. His uniform was slightly disheveled, as if he'd been roused from a nap. "Looks like we've had a power cut."
There was a woman, I whispered, my voice barely audible, as I leaned against the counter for support. My legs felt unsteady, and the terror I'd felt earlier hadn't faded. It had grown curling tighter around my heart. "She's gone now. Laura's gone too."
"Huh," Thomas asked, his brow furrowing as he stepped closer. "Gone? I don't know." "Where's Richard?" I asked, my voice shaking. The station felt wrong, like the walls themselves were holding their breath.
Thomas shrugged his torch beam, wavering slightly. "You're the first person I've found. Maybe we should check the fuse box or call." His words were cut off by a scream. Two voices, a man and a woman, their cries raw and piercing, echoing from deeper within the station. The sound was guttural, filled with pain and terror, and it sent a fresh wave of dread crashing over me.
"Laura," I whispered, my heart hammering.
Richard Thomas added, his voice tight with fear. I bolted from behind the counter, joining Thomas as we ran down a hallway that led into the heart of the station. The corridor was narrow, the walls lined with faded posters and locked doors, and our torch beams danced wildly as we moved. The screams grew louder, more desperate, guiding us toward their source. "This is Officer Thomas," he panted into his radio as we ran, requesting backup, power cut at the station, and potential disturbance. "Roger," came a garbled voice from the radio, distorted and faint as if struggling to break through static. We burst through a set of double doors and stumbled into the station's break room. The air was thick with the coppery stench of blood, and as Thomas's torch swept across the room, we saw a horror that seared itself into my memory. Officer Laura and Officer Richard lay sprawled across one of the break room tables, their bodies sawn neatly in half, just above their pelvic areas. The torchlight caught the sheen of fresh blood pooling beneath them, glistening on the table's laminated surface. Their eyes, wide and unseeing, stared blankly at the ceiling, their mouths frozen in the screams they'd unleashed in their final moments. The expressions on their faces, agony, terror, and something else, something incomprehensible, told a story of unimaginable suffering. I prayed their deaths had been swift, but the twisted agony in their features suggested otherwise. My legs buckled, and I gripped the edge of a chair to keep from collapsing, my vocal cords paralyzed by fear. Thomas screamed a raw, broken sound and rushed toward our fallen colleagues. His torch clattered to the floor, plunging the room back into darkness. The sudden absence of light felt like a physical blow, and for a fleeting moment I glimpsed something at the back of the room, a shape indistinct, but wrong lurking just beyond the edge of the shadows. Thomas picked the torch up. I begged, my voice shaking as I fumbled for my phone. My fingers felt clumsy, useless as panic clawed at my chest.
"They're gone," Thomas sobbed, his voice breaking. The sturdy officer I'd known for 5 years was gone, replaced by a trembling, weeping wreck. "Pick it up now!" Thomas, I insisted, my voice rising with desperation. I was a wreck too, my hands shaking so badly I could barely hold my phone. It wasn't courage or duty that kept me alert, it was raw, animalistic fear. I needed Thomas to pick up his torch because I knew with a certainty that made my blood run cold that we weren't alone in that room.
The sound of flesh slapping against the floor echoed in the darkness, wet, deliberate and close. I scrambled to activate my phone's torch, the beam cutting through the black like a knife.
Thomas was gone.
"Hello," I wheezed, my voice barely a whisper, as I swept the torch around the room. The beam trembled, revealing only the bloodied table and the lifeless bodies of Laura and Richard. The shadows seemed to pulse, as if alive, and the air grew colder, heavier. "Whoever's in here, reinforcements are on the way, so..." Roger crackled, a distorted voice from an unseen radio, its tone mocking and inhuman. "We'll escort you all..." My stomach dropped as I realized Thomas's call hadn't reached anyone. That voice, the same one I'd heard on the phone with the specialist, didn't belong to anything human. It was a sound that seemed to come from nowhere and everywhere, crawling under my skin like a living thing. More slaps of flesh against the floor came from behind me, slow and deliberate. I spun around my torch beam, slicing through the darkness, expecting to find nothing once again.
I screamed when I saw her. Clara.
But she was no longer the frail, frightened woman who'd stumbled into the station. Her eyes showed only the whites rolled so far back into her skull that they seemed to glow in the torchlight. Her mouth was impossible, stretched far beyond human limits, a gaping maw that spanned the width of her face and more. Her lips were cracked and bleeding, as if the act of opening her mouth so wide had torn her flesh.
And her teeth. God, her teeth. They weren't human. Long, needle-like incisors gleamed with blood, each one tapering to a point so fine it seemed to vanish into the air. Even her canines and molars were razor-sharp, capable of slicing through bone and flesh with surgical precision. The sight of her transformed into something monstrous was a violation of everything I knew to be real.
"Do you want me to stay, officer?" The thing cooed, its voice a sickening blend of Clara's and something older, hungrier. It tilted its head as if savoring my fear, playing with its prey. Then it charged toward me, moving with an unnatural speed, that defied her frail frame. I screamed a sound so loud it felt like my lungs would tear apart as I braced for death.
No.
The moments that followed are a blur, a haze of terror and disorientation. The responding officers later said they arrived within 20 minutes, but it felt like an eternity, or perhaps only seconds. When they restored power to the station, Clara was gone. The break room was as I'd left it, a tableau of horror, but she had vanished into the night. I was interrogated for hours about the deaths of Laura and Richard, and the disappearance of Thomas, who remains a suspect in the case alongside Clara. The CCTV footage showed her entering the station, her movements jerky and unnatural, but it cut out just before the blackout. The discrepancy between your story and the truth is curious. One interviewer said his eyes narrowing as he leaned across the table.
What discrepancy? I asked, my voice hoarse from exhaustion and fear.
Well, the power to the building was undoubtedly cut, he explained, his tone clipped. Yet the automatic doors were standing open when backup officers arrived at the station. My skin paled, a cold sweat breaking out across my body. He said I'd need permission to leave,